Hi, ninth grade English class. Today we're going to go over how to write an argumentative essay in order to develop your argumentative and persuasive writing skills. The structure of an argumentative essay is pretty simple. So you start off with a brief introduction, a body paragraph, a conclusion, and then at the end you have your MLA in text citations. We're not going to be going over that part today. We're just going to be focusing on how to write your essay. When you first start writing your introduction, what's important is that you move from general to specific. You're starting off with a hook that makes the reader interested, and then you move slowly into more specific details about what you want to write about. You're going to answer a question with a thesis statement and provide a summary or a roadmap of your essay, but you need to keep it brief. We're not writing the whole essay in one paragraph. At the end of the introduction, you end with a conclusion statement that's going to be referenced later on in your conclusion paragraph. The most important part of your introduction is your thesis. The question is, what makes your thesis strong, and how can you tell what a strong thesis is? Let's go over that and look at some examples. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and look at an example of a thesis. So this thesis 1, is, this paper will consider the advantages and disadvantages of certain restrictions on free speech. Now, there are a couple of problems with this thesis. Number 1, it is no different than a topic sentence. So this thesis is just basically a sentence that's going to cover the topic of the paper. Now let's go ahead and move on to the second sentence to see how a better thesis can be written based on this topic. So thesis 2 states, even though there may be considerable advantages to restricting hate speech, the possibility of chilling open dialogue on crucial racial issues is too great and too high a price to pay. Now this statement does a great couple of things. Number 1, it takes a position on an issue, meaning it is an argument or opinion. So whenever you're writing your thesis statement, you intend to write about your own opinion, and that opinion is your motivation for writing. So let's go ahead and look at another few examples of a thesis. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at 2 more examples of a thesis statement. So one is, the government has the right to limit free speech. The next is, the government has the right to limit free speech in cases of overtly racist or sexist language, because our failure to address such abuses would effectively suggest that our society condones such ignorant and hateful views. So in thesis 1, it's obvious to see it is non-specific. Not only is it non-specific, it's very broad. And because it is broad, it lacks structure within the whole sentence. Now, on thesis 2, it is very specific, with certain examples such as racist or sexist language. And why are we looking at that? Because our failures to address such abuses would effectively suggest that our society condones such ignorant and hateful views. This argument shows structure in the fact that it will hint at what body paragraphs will be used later in the paper. So a good thesis statement shows the reader what's going to come up next in the paper, and it also does a good job of keeping everything to a smaller topic. What do I mean by that? Well, when you look at the first paragraph, or the first thesis, this thesis has a very broad statement saying the government has the right to limit free speech. Well, what are we talking about when it says limit free speech. You can say that this is a very broad statement, but whenever you go over to the second thesis, it talks about limiting racist or sexist language, meaning the topic will be smaller, and that means that the paper will be smaller. So if you're trying to have a large paper, then maybe that first broad statement would be better for you, but I would argue that since we're going over the basis of just understanding how to write an argumentative essay, you need to be more specific in your language. Let's take a quick look at what we've learned and what else I want you to remember when writing your thesis statement. So the first thing is that a thesis statement takes a certain stance on a topic or issue. What does that mean? A thesis is an argument made by the writer to the reader, meaning it is an opinion that needs to be supported by the body paragraphs later on in the essay. Why is it important? Well, the thesis is the roadmap to the whole or the structure of the entire essay. The thesis is also very specific and not broad. And that is important because we need to make sure that the argument isn't too long whenever we're writing the paper. And the last thing that I didn't really talk about is making sure that the thesis is something that can be argued. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes you can have a thesis that looks like it's just a statement. So a statement is something that can't be argued, such as there are always alternatives to using hate speech. That is a fact. We're not looking for facts. We're looking for something that is arguable, and it must present a view that someone might reasonably argue against. And that's really important in remembering. So it can be argued, and it must not be a statement of facts. So if you want to take a screenshot of this, you can. We're going to go ahead and move on to body paragraphs. Body paragraphs are the building blocks to your argument. They are the answer to the question that you developed in your thesis. It's important that you know your material before you write your body paragraphs, because without knowing your material, you won't be able to make a proper argument. The parts of a paragraph are shown here in this diagram that looks like a burger. It's a really great diagram, and it's going to be basically how you write every single body paragraph in every single paper or argumentative paper that you will write. So at first, we're going to start with a topic sentence, which is your top bun. The topic sentence is what's going to be your introduction for that body paragraph. So your whole body paragraph needs to be about this topic sentence. You don't want to stray from that because it might throw off the reader and make your argument less reliable. Speaking of reliability, supporting details are the tomato, lettuce, and meat of your burger. A lot of people will argue that this part is probably the most important part, and during this part, you're going to be using relevant examples and authoritative quotes. You need to make sure that you are citing, because citing is extremely important in this section. And then after you use supporting details that you explain, because you can't just throw a quote in there and leave it. You need to make sure you're explaining your quotes and explaining why they're important to your argument. You go on to your colorful vocabulary, which is the mustard, ketchup, and relish, which I really like because it's almost like a spice, because that's basically what you're looking for. Now, you don't want to be throwing large words. You don't want to use a thesaurus to find every single word in your paragraphs. You don't want that. You want your paragraphs to just use higher level language. You're not trying to make it crazy complicated. and then your concluding sentence, which is going to reference back to your conclusion that you referenced in the end of your introduction, because it makes everything full circle, and at the end, whenever you are writing your conclusion, it's going to matter. Look at two examples to compare. The weather in 1816 Europe was abnormally wet, keeping many inhabitants indoors that summer. From April until September of that year, it rained in Switzerland on 130 out of the 183 days from April to September. Unlike today, one could not simply turn on a television or click through the internet in order to entertain oneself. Instead, it was much more common for the educated people of the day to spend time reading, discussing well-known authors and artists of the day, playing at cards, and walking in their gardens and walking paths. Now let's take a look at the second paragraph. I hate wet and rainy days. It rained a lot in 1816. A lot. Like every day. The weather in Europe was abnormally wet because it rained in Switzerland on 130 out of the 183 days from April to September. If I was Mary Shelley, I might decide to write a book too. After all, it was the only thing you could do without a TV or anything. She said that she passed the summer of 1816 in the environs of Geneva. We occasionally amused ourselves with some German stories of ghosts. These tales excited us in a playful desire of intimidation. So people were stuck inside and bored. Mary Shelley decided to write a book because it was so awful outside. I can totally see her point, you know. I guess I would write a novel if there was nothing else to do. So there's a couple of issues with this paragraph based off the first paragraph. So if the first paragraph was a good example, this one is not the best example. And that starts right here in that first sentence. I hate wet and rainy days. This issue starts with the structure. So it is not indented like a typical paragraph would be. I hate wet and rainy days is not a good starting sentence because it's not telling us what the whole paragraph is going to be about, and also it is spelt incorrectly. And then this section right here should be cited because it's a fact. And this section here doesn't have any citation, even though it is quoted. Also, right afterwards, it says, so people were stuck inside and bored, but this does not affect what Mary Shelley felt based off of this paragraph. Based off of this quotation. Mary Shelley thinks that these tales excited them in a playful desire of intimidation, meaning they inspired her to write her story. Whenever the author of this paragraph thinks that the people were stuck inside and bored, this doesn't reflect her feelings. So, whenever she says, I can totally see your point, I guess I would write a novel too, there's another issue here. It's going to be not in first person. Whenever you're writing an essay, you want to make sure that it's not in first person, especially if it's an argumentative essay. So those are just a few glaring issues with this one, but if you want to pause and look at it and see if you can find any more, I definitely recommend it, but we're going to move on to the conclusion. A lot of people will argue that the conclusion is the hardest part of the essay, and that makes sense because after you've written a ton about how you feel about a certain issue, it's hard to come up with something extra to say. So I'm going to go ahead and just take some notes, and we're just going to talk it through. To start, just like a body paragraph, we're going to start with a topic sentence. But what is the topic sentence of a conclusion paragraph? Well, it's a rehashing of the thesis. Meaning you're just going to rephrase the thesis to bring the reader back into that argument. And then we're going to start with supporting sentences. And what are the supporting sentences in a thesis? These are going to be major points and arguments that you've made throughout the paper that you're going to connect together. And then finally, you're going to have your closing sentences. It's going to connect back to that thesis. And I recommend that you think about something greater than the thesis. So like things about the human experience is a really great thing to think about whenever you're trying to come up with something more to say about your argument. It basically gives that final word and it gives the reader a sense of closure. And that's it for writing an argumentative essay. I hope that you do well on your paper and good luck.